Welcome to another episode with Books with Beste. Today I'm joined with Vera Jo Bustos, who wrote A Mindful Journey. Welcome to the show.
Yes, thanks for having me, Connor. Excited.
All right, to dive right in, first question for you. Why did you write this book?
When I started off as a high school athlete and as a college athlete, I didn't feel like there was much in terms of the mental game for me to kind of follow. And even at that, growing up as well, I just felt like all these big time athletes, all these professional athletes, all these famous athletes who I looked up to were so much above and beyond what I was capable of. And so as I started working with other young athletes now with my current career as a mentality coach, which started years ago, I figured, why not write a book that's a little bit more relatable than somebody like LeBron James or Giannis, right? Where you pour through the vulnerabilities and the challenges and the adversities that you go through on a day-to-day basis and let people know, hey, it's okay to actually feel this way. It's okay to have self-doubts. It's okay to have these self-perceived limitations, but only for a minute. Because if we get stuck in that, that's when we get in trouble. And so we have to understand that as humans, we all kind of struggle with these darknesses, but we have to be able to get through that 80% darkness to the 20% of the light. And that's really what I wanted to convey in this book is a little bit of mindfulness training and mentality training throughout the book, but mostly just to let young athletes know that it's okay to be human and have all these feelings. And this is how we get past it to become the best version of you that you can be.
Awesome. And so could you kind of talk about, I thought it was funny reading the first part where you're flying over and you just get overseas and what that is like, because here in the US, I tend to drive everywhere because I don't like dealing with airports and how confusing they are. So can you kind of talk about what it's like to, travel across the ocean and the like the language barrier and some of the things you have to deal with and adjust to?
Well, right off the bat, I got lost in the Germany airport. And it was one of the most scariest moments of my life. And back, I don't know, what was it, 2012, something along there, 2011, didn't really have cell reception out there. So I'm just kind of going blind, like I can't call anybody for help. Who's even going to know how to help me in Germany? And so I'm trying to find somebody to help me. And of course, my American accent comes out, and the people in the airport just aren't all that friendly. And then I actually get to Greece and I just see the signs in Greece. And if you've ever seen the Greek alphabet, at first glance in my mind, oh my gosh, this is alien writing. Like these are symbols, not letters. Like, how am I ever going to get by here? And so it was just the overwhelming feeling of, oh my gosh, I'm an alien. What is this going to amount to? It was very overwhelming. And I do remember still, and I tell everybody, my first night there, I definitely cried myself to sleep thinking, what did I get myself into?
Awesome. And kind of on that note, like from the whole year being over there, how did the journey of playing overseas, how did you grow as a person?
That's a great question. And I think in hindsight, reflection was probably the best tool that I had. I kept a blog while I was out there and a personal journal. And if it wasn't for those moments where I actually sat with myself in my solitude, because I had a studio apartment and I only had the internet, which wasn't very good. It was in and out all the time. So there were often moments where I went 5 to 8 hours without the internet. I didn't have the TV. Well, I did have a TV, but it was only Greek speaking channel. So I really didn't have a TV. And in those moments, I would just sit with myself alone with my thoughts and reflect on what I was going through, what I was dealing with, the challenges. And if, as you see through the book, I kind of have these negative moments and I go through it over and over. It's like, again, I was feeling like this again, but I always found the way to bring out the positive side of it and to be optimistic about the challenges that I was facing. So if it wasn't for those moments of reflection, I'm not so sure if I would have made it, because it was definitely a challenging situation in so many ways. And then, of course, my Greek family, as I like to call them, um, they were definitely a saving grace out there.
Awesome. And so kind of from the personal growth now, and you talked a little bit about it, but how did this whole experience inspire and lead to what you're currently doing right now?
So when I was first, geez, I think it was probably about 5 months in, I just started asking myself, what's my why? What's my purpose? What could I help other people, other athletes do to help them achieve their goals? And it was actually sitting in there that I came up with the idea of basketball training, you know, teaching these young athletes what it takes to get to the next level, what it takes to attain their dream of playing at the next level. And the next level could be middle school to high school. The next level could be JV to varsity, varsity to college, and so forth. But how do we train ourselves to get to that next level? And from that, that's when mentality solutions kind of came aboard, because it was just a basketball training, but I also did mentality training within that. And I actually had a parent come up to me and said, hey, can we just schedule an hour for you to only talk about the mentality side of things with my daughter? I was like, oh my gosh, why haven't I thought of that? And so that's kind of how mentality solutions was branched off separately. And from there, it just really took off. But it came back to, again, one of those reflections and moments of finding a reason and a calling that was bigger than myself. How could I give back? How could I help other people attain their dreams? And that's one of the reasons why I love sharing my story. Because if you look back and if you see me in person, I know we met a couple of years ago at the Final Four. And if you were to see my frame, you're like, no way, you played professional basketball like you, right? I mean, I'm not that tall. I'm not the most athletic specimen that you see. I'm very thin, if anything. But I love to share my story because if you have the drive, you have the discipline, and you have the mindset, you can make it to the next level. And I say, if I can do it, you can do it. You just have to have those three things and do the things that most people aren't willing to do. And I talked about the 80% and 20%, where the journey, a lot of the time, is that 80% of darkness that you have to get through the pain. You have to get through the doubts, the limitations that you feel. I call them gremlins, those negative thoughts that you have. You have to get through that 80% to enjoy the 20% of light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, along with that, there's some other books that, once I started reading more on leadership, the mental side of the game and things like that, and I started to do more reflecting myself, I find, looking back, it's like the best games I ever had were when I was like doing things that they talked about. And then I always then put it in my head where I'm like, gosh, if only I would have read this book when I was like an eighth grader or a ninth grader. And so like, I think there's like it, from what you see, like, are people just like high school, middle school players, are they just not develop, like, do they just not know how to do reflections? Do you teach them that? Like, how valuable is that with the clients that you work with?
So, with my clients and with everybody, the athletes that I work with, I say for the complete athlete, as I like to refer, there's three different gears that make an athlete complete or to get to that elite level. And most of the time, what we just train in our society here in America is the strength and conditioning. That's one gear, right? You have to be in shape. If you're going to be good at anything, you have to be able to be in shape and have the physical strength to get by. The second gear is your skill set, right? So if you think of Steph Curry, for example, he has to be in shape to run off those screens all game long. And if he's not in shape, he's not going to have the legs to shoot a 3-pointer at the end of the game. So the two have to work together. And if you're ever not in shape, I'm sure you know as an athlete, it's not going to work. You're going to crumble. And because you're not in shape, your mindset is probably going to go crumbling down as well. And so you have the physical side of the game, strength and conditioning, your skill set. But the third gear is your mentality, it's your mental game. And those three gears work together. And so if one ever stalls or gets stuck, the other two also stall and get stuck. And most of the time, where athletes put all their time and attention, and where most of these coaches throw all their resources, are on the first two gears. Where, yes, those are important, but nobody ever spends any time on the third gear. And I would even argue that so many coaches and parents and trainers out there are prepping these athletes with the first 2 gears. And then with the mental gear, they just, oh, you can figure this out. Let's just throw you to the wolves and see how you do. Well, it's no wonder why so many athletes are drowning during this, because we're not prepping them with the tools that they need to overcome these challenging situations. How do you expect an athlete to lead? I would argue that leadership is a learned capability. Anybody can be a leader. I would argue that performing under crunch time is a learned capability. And these are all things that I coach in the mental performance side. That psychological part of it too is you got to train your brain.
Okay, so when you're overseas and you're writing and through the book, you talk about how you go into these moments of, you know, where you have that doubt, you have these negative thoughts and stuff like that, and then you come out of it and then you kind of go back into it. Can you kind of talk about how, like, you have to rep that third gear like you rep the other two and how important that is?
Absolutely. And one of the things that I started while I was out in Greece, and we've heard it all the time. And one of those things where you hear all the time, and there's probably a reason why we've heard this a million times, is because it's important and because it works. And so what I started doing out in Greece was practicing gratitude every morning. If I started my day on the right track, the rest of the day would follow. And so even before I got to my studio apartment, I had no idea what to expect. I didn't know if it was going to be a little hole in the wall or just this magnificent studio where I was like, oh my gosh. But before I even walked in, I just said in my mind, I love it. Before I even knew what it looked like. Because if I train myself in my mind to say that I love it, then I will. So I just set the expectation already that I'm going to love this. And even before that, just practicing that gratitude. And this is something that I do today. And I know the listeners won't be able to see this, but those of us who see, I actually have these Hershey's golden nuggets, and I call them your golden nuggets. And I have 3 of them in a bowl in here. And so every day I think of 3 things that I'm grateful for, and I drop them in the bowl and I write them down in my planner. I know you're huge on planners too. You can appreciate this. And then I have my second bowl here, and I can't end the day until I give 3 nuggets away. And so by giving those nuggets away, not only am I focusing on what I'm grateful for and the blessings that are afforded to me, but I also find a way to bless somebody else. And it can just be something as simple as shooting somebody a text message, opening a door for a stranger, just exchanging eye contact and saying a simple greeting to somebody as they're walking by. Something's just simple, but you give something away.
Yeah, and I think that's like what is so unique about the mental side of the game too, is that you don't need to spend $20,000 on software or facilities or anything. Like, these are very basic things that you can do, and then it's just a matter of doing them daily. And like, I mean, I do it with a note card in the morning where I just spend 10 minutes, like, write down everything you're grateful for. And then, like, it's amazing how after you do it for 4 or 5 days, you know, or the first couple days to get into the habit, you have to be like, I have access to clean water, like I have clothes, like,
Right.
but I'm still grateful for them. But like, how many other days do I even think of that? Like, I have these like very basic things that I don't even think of because they're just always here. And so, like, being intentional about recognizing them, because it's hard to feel entitled or, oh, I want this or I want that, when you're just like taking in the moment of like, wow, I have so much to be grateful for right now.
Right. One of the exercises I take my clients through as they're trying to think about things they're grateful for, because if you do this on a consistent basis, like you said, it is hard to continue to think about different things. And so I asked them, if you were in the movie Castaway, let's just say, if you were stranded in a cave and you lived in a cave for 5 years, what would you miss the most about your current life? Even in this pandemic, even in COVID, what would you miss? And that gets you thinking about the little things that you would probably overlook on a daily basis. And so I know you're a big fan of James Clear, and I actually got this from him, but you're probably familiar with the term habit stacking. And so once my clients have taken a month or two to develop this habit into where it becomes consistent, then we start to habit stack on top of that. So we not only think about the things we're grateful for, but then we also add our daily wins. So before the day starts as well, we have 3 things. What are my 3 wins for the day? What are the 3 things that I want to accomplish? And so I start off with my gratitude, and then I focus on my next wins for the day. And then once we get that going, then we have it stack again. And then we get into what I call deep work, is allowing us to focus primarily on the task at hand. Because every athlete, every executive, every coach, everybody always wants to get into flow state. Everybody always wants to get into the zone. And this is the prime way that we get there. If we can't stay in the moment, if we can't train ourselves to stay in the moment, there is no way that we are ever going to get into these flow states. And so that's the first way of training that. And I also have 7 other layers deeper that we get into that. But if you can't even focus on what you're doing right now without being distracted by your phone every 30 seconds, you're going to have a really tough time getting into that flow state in anything that you're doing, whether that's a presentation, trying to write a paper, or sinking a free throw in crunch time.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because like no matter how refined someone is on the physical training or the technical skills, it always seems like when you talk about what's inhibiting you from getting into that flow state, it's always that third gear, and it's the mental side of it.
Right. And there's a fine line to that too. So you can't necessarily be a beginner or a novice at something to get into flow state. Right. So I just went skiing yesterday, and this was just popping up in my head as well. But as I'm going down the slopes and it starts to get a little bit right at the bubble of my comfort zone, it's just amazing how my mind was just tunnel vision, complete and utter focus, because it was a little bit harder than I was anticipating. And so I had to focus. Whereas if I'm a beginner and I go back to when I first started skiing, well, I probably wouldn't be able to get into flow state because all my energy and all my focus is trying not to fall down. I'm just trying to stay on my feet. Right. So as a beginner, you have to, and going back to those 3 gears, as a beginner, you have to have the strength to stay on your skis. You have to be able to have the balance to do that. That's the first gear. The second gear is you need to develop the skill to actually be comfortable going down the slopes. And then the third gear comes with that, where you just focus on what you're doing. And then that's when you just shred it.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because that makes me think of when we talk about and I'm sure you've seen the same thing, but it seemed like the biggest adjustment from the college teams I've been on is that like freshmen always struggle with like the pace of the game when they first get to college. And they talk about how like getting acclimated to college, the game slows down. And I think like you hit it on the head, where it's like you have to be able to, you know, sprint and do those things at a high level, because if you don't, that's where all your mental energy is going, is making sure you're doing the right action, the right movements and stuff like that. Well, once you master those, then you free up the mental capacity to, oh, hey, they're doing this on this ball screen, so I'm going to do this. Well, it's like you don't even think about that if you're so concerned with how you're coming off of it.
Right. And I also talk about this in the book, but another thing that I go more in depth with my clients is what I call the growth cycle. And a lot of times, not just athletes, but everybody, they try to skip steps, right? So I can't just go from learning to performance stage. That's just calling for disaster, right? So we have to learn. So, for example, if I'm seeing something that Steph Curry is doing, I see a move that he wants to do. Let's just talk physically. Well, I have to watch to see how his body moves. I have to watch his footwork. I have to watch his speed. I have to watch his mechanics. There's so many things and little subtleties I need to watch in order to then try to replicate that myself. And then we go into the practice or experimenting stage, right? And then in those two, we're always indefinitely going to struggle. Struggle is inevitable in growth. And if you're not struggling, you're probably not pushing yourself hard enough. And so a lot of times the athletes that I work with, they get so frustrated because of this struggle, this internal or external struggle that they're dealing with, because the mental game has a lot of internal struggle as well. And so that's where I go back to, hey, that 80%, you're in that 80% right now. And a lot of athletes quit at around 60 to 70%. They're almost there. It's the same concept as pushing through physically to get to that next level. And if you just push through a little bit more, then that's when we see the light. It's the same concept, whether we're talking physical or mental.
Awesome. And so you have experience playing professionally, playing in college, and then you came back and you also coached in college. So I guess my question is, now that you're doing the mentality training, where are the gaps that you see from players where there's a disconnect with the mental game, and then where's the gap with coaches even with the mental game?
With players, and this is a great question, by the way. With players, I would say the biggest gap is they just, when they hear mentality training, it's like, oh, yeah, I visualize. Yeah, I breathe. And that's it. And there's just so much more. I don't even like really to use the term visualization anymore, because athletes hear the word and they just kind of tune out. Like, oh, I've heard this 1,000 times. I don't need to do this. And so we go into more in-depth ways to grow. But I would say, and this goes for coaches too, it's getting to be a little bit better now, but I would say a lot of coaches and athletes don't think it's as important as the physical side of the game. Right? So you'll have athletes, and speaking basketball, this is what we know best, but athletes will get 500 shots up every day and spend zero time on their mental game. Or they think that spending a minute visualizing their next game is working on their mental game, when it's actually so much deeper than that. And for coaches, I would say the biggest gap is they don't know what they don't know. And a lot of them too, and I won't speak on all coaches, but a little bit of what I've seen is sometimes these Division 1 coaches, they have the resources and the money, but for them it's kind of like, oh, I don't want to bring anybody else in. I don't want to feed them stuff that's not in congruence with my culture. And then these smaller schools, Division 2, Division 3, NAI, even JUCO, they just want all the resources they can have. They just can't afford it. And so there's just kind of that gap a little bit, that I've seen with some of these coaches and the size of the schools.
Yeah, and I think it's like with the virus and, so many factors that are now even on top of just like, if the virus didn't happen, like there's still a need for the mental side of it. And now like it's just furthering the need for those positions. And I was talking on the previous episode where a team has a whole athletic training department for all their athletes. They have coaching staffs for each program in each sport. But then it's like the only resources for anything related to mental health, and not even getting into like mental training or sports psychologists, it's like there's nothing. And so it's like there's like a whole gap from like the whole college level from understanding how important it is.
Right. Well, and again, we go, and I always refer back to these 3 gears. And if you actually see my logo, there's a reason why they're gears. It's because of this. I talk about it everywhere I go. And so, like you said, okay, we have our strength and conditioning coach, we have our athletic trainers, we have our assistant coaches who are spending all their time working on this skill. But again, we always ignore the 3rd gear, or we'll bring in a speaker once a year. Oh, yeah, we covered it. This is something that you have to do every single day if you want to take your game to the next level. I mean, throughout a name of the greats in the game of basketball, I guarantee you that those athletes are spending time above and beyond on their mental game. There's a fine line that separates the good from the great and the great from the elite. And most of the time, it's really not anything physical. Because if you get to the highest level of play, if you go to the NBA and the WNBA, even just thinking about the NBA, most of these athletes are very similar in their skill set. Most of these athletes are very similar in their size, in their height, in their strength. But what is it that separated MJ from everybody else? What is it that separated Kobe from everybody else? Even LeBron James, I would argue. And there's so many others, KD, I would throw in there as well. Even Tom Brady, let's say, for example, okay? Most of them have this. They have the mindset, they have that killer instinct, that competitive edge. And it's that edge that sets them apart. And most of the time, the edge that most people are looking for is the mental edge. Yet we don't spend any time working on that. We don't take the time to get through that 80% of darkness to get through to the 20% of light.
And I think that's like another like, important point where you mentioned like the greats, but like you even hear the stories of, the sixth man or this role player or that role player. it's like the reason that they were so good is that their mindset was, hey, I know what I need to do as the sixth man to help our team win. And like then they have like a great game or performance in a certain amount of like, you know, in a certain period of the season where like they just get all this attention. But then you look back at it, it's like, no, it's they mentally figured out what they needed to do for their team.
Right. Well, I think Jeremy Lin is a great example of that. I mean, go back to, I forget which year it was, but Linsanity, right? Linsanity. I mean, and this is probably a kid who spent actual time on his mental game. And even arguably now that he's trying to get back into the spotlight, I can probably guess that he's spending actual time on his mental game as well. Anybody who's trying to take their game to the next level is spending some kind of time on their mental game.
Awesome. Kind of diving into some specifics within the book. What I thought was really interesting is, so like there's been some times where I hear people, you know, like, oh, body language isn't that important, etc. Like just because they're doing this doesn't mean, you know, this or that. But can you speak on how important body language actually is, especially when you're dealing with like a language barrier where like it's not verbal communication, and how telling body language is, whether it's on the court or it's, you know, at a restaurant?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was my prime way of communication, probably for the first 2 to 3 months until I started learning the language a little bit. And so I just think, and this is again something that I teach my clients, but just think of, and I'll run you even through a little something that I give to my clients. So if you think of a time, Connor, when you were intimidated, let's just say, think back to grade school, middle school, high school, whenever that time was, when you came face to face with an athlete who intimidated you. What
Never
was it? You never been
happened.
intimidated.
No,
Oh,
I'm just kidding.
you're not human.
I'm just
Right?
kidding.
So what is it, or what was it about this athlete that intimidated you? If we think back to it, think back to their body language. They probably kind of had a little swag about them. They probably gave out a little bit of a vibe, right? Where they were very confident. And we can come back to confidence too. This is one of the main things that I teach. But they have and they exude this confidence within them. And because they exude that confidence, you feel that vibe. And then you see that they're holding themselves upright. They're walking around kind of with that swag. And you're just like, oh man, well, why can't we do that? Why can't we replicate that? And it all starts with body language. So if we fix our body language, then that goes to our thoughts. And then if we can fix our thoughts, then that goes to our actions. And then once we fix our actions, then we can go to our training and our performance. And that's one of the main things that I teach in one of my curriculum is mindset of confidence. It's we have to, whatever we think, right? Our thoughts, our actions, how we train, and how we perform.
Yeah, and I think there's like, you know, there's the quote that's thrown around where it's like, you know, your thoughts become your actions become your habits. But like, I think it's also like it works multiple ways. It's so fluid because it, like when you talk about that, I think of the book by Amy Cuddy, the oh, I forget, it's called Presence, and she talks about like power posing, how
Right.
like literally just standing with your, you know, hands on your hips, chest out, like that physiologically triggers you to feel more confident and be able, so like she would say, you know, do it before you had a meeting where you go and ask for a raise. And like I think the same works for athletes. And so it's crazy how much fluidity there is between like using your actions to influence your thoughts, using your thoughts to influence your actions.
Well, and a main thing that I teach, because I think this is something else that we ignore, even when you talk about visualization. Well, what is it that you want to see? What do you want to do? Most of the time as athletes, all we do is think about the best case scenario. All we think about is hitting that three at the buzzer. All we think about is making that stop in crunch time. All we think about are the positive things that are going to happen. But I call this our mistake routine response. Mistake routine response. So when you make a mistake, how are you going to respond? And if you actually have a plan in place before that mistake happens, you're more inclined to respond the way that you prepared for ahead of time. So in basketball, for example, It's inevitable that you're going to turn the ball over at some point in your career. So when that happens, how do you want to respond? When you miss, let's say, 5 shots in a row, how do you want to respond? And if we don't take the time to address that beforehand, chances are that we're going to crash, we're going to collapse. And if you think about the elite athletes, they have an immediate response to that mistake response, to whereas most beginners and most high school, middle school, they just crash after that mistake. And so that's something that we have to train up as well. And
Well,
that
and I
coincides with body language 100%.
yeah, and I think it's interesting when you say that, like, athletes kind of don't respond well to that visualization word, and I just can't help but think that part of it might be that, like, yeah, it's a program brings in a one-time speaker, or they do it once, so then by doing it once and not just getting that immediate result, then they're telling themselves this doesn't work. Well, then it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, where if you say this doesn't work, I'm not, like, why would I do it? If that's your mindset going into it, no matter how many times you do it, it's never going to work. And so I think, like, and then it goes back to the coaches don't know what they don't know, and how to intentionally do it to build up that skill so our athletes can see results from it.
This is actually a huge gap. And going back to that, this is a huge gap because a coach would never, at the beginning of the season, let's just say, okay, second week of practice, we're going to put out in this baseline out of bounds play. And I'm only going to put it in this one time. We're going to spend a whole hour on it. And then at the end of the season, I'm going to ask you to perform that baseline out of bounds in the last 2 minutes of the game. How many athletes do you think are going to actually remember something you taught 9 months ago, 6 months ago, 1 month ago? What about a week ago? This is something you have to do every single day. If you want your athletes to remember this, if you want your athletes to actually do this on a daily basis, you have to do it on a daily basis. So if you're a shooter, you're probably not going to go many consecutive days without shooting if that's what you hang your hat on. Right? So what is it that you want to be great at? What do you want to hang your hat on? Those are the things that you need to be doing consistently on a daily basis. And so I know you've had Alan Stein on this as well. And I love Alan. I look up to him so much. But one of my favorite quotes of all time is his quote, are the habits you have today on par with the dreams you have for tomorrow. And that's something I ask my athletes every day. And I ask them to reflect on that. So where do you want to go? What are your goals? What are you doing today that's going to bring you closer to that goal? So if you say you want to be mentally tough, you want to be mentally resilient, you want to set yourself apart with this mental edge, what have you done today to get there? And
I
if
love
you
that.
don't have the answer for that, then you need to either reassess your habits or reassess your goals.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I like that you said in the book was you talk about growth can only be measured in hindsight. And that just makes me think how important what we talked about earlier with reflections. Like, if you're not reflecting, on your game, your performance or practice, like, you're not connecting the dots backwards and how much you've come. And especially with, like, daily habits, and James Clear talks about the 1% better each day. So, like, how do you know if you're, being 1% better, or having those habits and actions that are leading to those results, if you're not reflecting consciously on, like, hey, I've been doing this, and wow, this last month I've seen this much growth from myself. Like, it's not a lot, but thinking back on day 1 and now I'm on day 30, like, I can see that change starting to happen.
Right. And we kind of have a bias with our growth too, because as we're going through something, and if you were to look at the growth cycle that I talk about, as we're going through that growth cycle, while we're in it, majority of the time while we're in the learning stage, while we're in the experimenting stage, we're always struggling. And so because we have some type of struggle, we feel like we're not growing. It's only in hindsight that we see how far we've come. And we have to be mindful of the size of steps that we take. And that's why, James Clear 1% better. So if you take multiple small steps every single day versus giant leaps, how much effort, time, and resources are you going to spend trying to reach that huge step ahead of you versus if you just focused on one thing every single day? And that's why I love to tier some of these morning habits and daily habits that we have. The gratitude is one, your daily wins is another. I call it deep work, eat that frog, make your bed. It's another one I give to my athletes every day. Develop discipline, accountability, and accomplishment right off the bat. Set your day apart from everybody else. But there's so many little things that you could do to set yourself apart. And if you're too big to do the little things, how far are you actually going to go?
Yeah, I love that. One of the other things, like kind of in terms of like the negative thoughts and how much of a habit you have to build to see the growth in these areas, is you say courage cannot exist without fear. And I think a lot of times people, and you said some people can run from fear or some people can run towards something. But I think it's important to note that like it's totally normal to be anxious about a performance, even if you are, well trained and well prepared. It's normal to have a little self-doubt, a little fear, a little things like that. But like you also can't be courageous without that. Could you
Right.
kind of go deeper on that?
Absolutely. And this is one of my favorite things that I coach my athletes. And so if you think about this fear that you have, and let's just use basketball again as an example. So let's just say that you're playing in the biggest game of your life, whether that's a state championship, whether that's a conference championship, whether that's the NCAA tournament, whatever it is. Most of the time before this game, you're going to kind of have probably some type of fear. You're going to have jitters. You're going to have anxiety. You're going to be extremely nervous. And all of those can kind of correspond to some type of fear that we have. But a lot of times, too, fear exists within our bodies for a reason, right? And I'm not going to go too psychological on you here, but the reason why we internally have fear is because when there's a busy highway, that fear is what keeps you from running into that highway, right? If we're on a ledge, that fear is what keeps us safe on the big side of the ledge. And so that fear is innate within us for a reason, is to keep us alive. But these days, our fears have transformed into completely different scenarios where even the fact of shooting a free throw can be debilitating in some situations. And so we have to reassess the way that we see and perceive fear. And so to do that, just think of physiologically, so physiologically, how your body responds to when you're fearful, anxious, nervous about something. And most of the time, 99% of people get the butterflies, right? We maybe get a little bit of stress sweat, our adrenaline goes up, and our heartbeat races. That's what tends to happen, right? And I shared this in the book too. And so now let's go to something that we're excited about. And so I use a roller coaster most of the time. As a kid, most of us are excited about this roller coaster. We spend 20 minutes or not longer to get on. You're finally strapped in. You know this roller coaster goes 0 to 120 miles an hour in 3 seconds. As you're sitting there anticipating, waiting for this exciting moment to come, I guarantee you probably still have the butterflies. Your adrenaline level is still through the roof. Your heartbeat is pounding. You probably still have that stress sweat as you're holding on to the handlebars. So I have my athletes and my clients actually write a T-chart. Okay, physiologically, whether you're nervous, whether you're excited, whether you're anxious, whether you're fearful, look at how your body responds to each of those. And if you look side by side, your body responds the exact same way. And you've probably heard this before. The only difference is the word you choose to give it. The only difference is the way you choose to perceive the situation. And it's often our perceptions that hinder our growth.
Yeah, and I think Simon Sinek there's a clip of him where he talked about it, where that using that different word there, like instead of saying I'm nervous, he says I'm excited.
Right.
Yeah, and that whole shift can put you at ease on the mental side of the game, but like your body's still going to be doing the same thing regardless.
And again, so this is where we kind of have to transform our relationship with fear too. So if we think of how we get when we're excited, and there's a reason why your body's reacting this way. So if we think of just in athletics, for example, we want our heartbeat to pump a little bit faster because we need the blood to go through our system, right? We want our testosterone essentially to go up a little bit too. We want to be more assertive. And all of these things that happen, this chemical cocktail, as I like to call it, within our body, it all happens for a reason. If we didn't feel these things, then we wouldn't be ready to go on a moment's notice. So we need that adrenaline pumping through our system. And so when we feel this way, again, assuming that all three gears are firing, I'm prepared. This is the first source of confidence. I've prepared for this, assuming that I've practiced and prepared. Then this is just my body's way. Oh, I'm so ready. I feel my heartbeat. Yep. This is my body's way of telling me I'm ready to go. And I always say it's okay to have butterflies as long as they're flying in formation.
I like that. Um, you talk about, so there's a couple more things I want to hit on real quick. You talk a lot about living in the moment, and specifically, you said, when we are one place, we think about being somewhere else, and that kind of battle you have where, you're overseas, so you think about home, and then when you're at home, you think about being back overseas. I almost think that like one of the huge separators going forward is, like being athletic, being strong, being quick, all those things are going to matter. But it seems like in the age of distraction that we live in, it's like the true separator at some point is going to be, are you able to focus and stay present where you're at doing what you're doing?
Right. And that's where I've termed deep work. And this is something that I try to go deep with my athletes with. And again, going into flow state. If you ever want to, and flow state isn't just for athletes, you can flow writing a paper, you can flow writing the book that you're about to do. Anything that we do that's worthwhile, we have to do in that flow state to get the best out of ourselves. And that kind of, there's a lot that goes on in the brain I won't get into. But by living in the moment and by choosing to deliberately live in the moment every single day is the best practice you can do for mindfulness. And there's a lot of little tips and tricks I give to get there. But if you can practice that, and Kobe was a great teacher. I mean, I used Kobe, I never knew him personally, but I chose him as a mentor and I just absorbed everything. And there was actually a clip of him where he talked about when he identified how living in the moment could take his game to the next level. And so he talked about a game where they were up by 1 or 2 points. I believe they were up by one, and the opposing team came down, shot went up, and he just followed the flight of the ball. His man cut behind him, got the O board, put it back. They lost the game. The next day, he's sitting in math class, and his mind starts to wander. His mind starts to drift, just like it did the night before in that game. And he immediately made the connection. It's because his mind was wandering that mistake happened. So if he could choose to always be in the here and now and to keep his mind from distractions, to always be present, that was going to make him into the best player possible. And that's how we know Kobe Bryant.
And I think that transitions good into this next topic, self-discipline, because I think that there's, you could argue there's a disconnect there from whether it's sports or going to a career. Like if you're a college athlete, like you're kind of always told, like, here's your study hall, here's your classes, here's practice. If you're not paying attention to coach at practice, you're going to run. That's going to make you pay attention. But like when you're a pro overseas, like you're on your own for, your shooting workouts, your extra reps and stuff like that. And it's true in the world outside of sports. When you go from college to a job, you're expected to do the job. You're not going to have someone with you 24/7 making sure you do all these things. So could you kind of talk about the self-discipline that you learned from your overseas experience and kind of how you work with your athletes now?
Sure. That for me, it tends to always come back to my why. And while I was out there, why was I doing this? Why was I getting up, busting my butt? Why was I doing extra weights? Why was I getting more shots in? And part of it was coming back to that fear. I think fear can be a great motivator at times because it's such a cutthroat culture out there where I saw, I don't know, 7, 8 Americans come and go because they just didn't pan out. And, oh, you're not good enough, next up. So it was kind of that fear like, man, I got to be on my A game all the time. And so that was a discipline driver. But more importantly, it came back to my why. This is my dream. This has been my dream since as far as I can remember. And I'm actually here living this right now. How can I be the best version of myself in this moment? I don't want to look back with any regrets. Pain of discipline or pain of regret. I would rather have the pain of discipline in this moment to look back and know that I gave it absolutely everything I have.
All right, that's awesome. So going forward, if you know whether it's a coach, an athlete, or anybody they're wanting to find your book or have you come and speak or work with you, where can they find you? Social media, website, and all that stuff.
The best way would be on my website, and that's mentalitysolutions.com. And you can find my book there as well. You can get an author signed copy or a personalized message. If you want a bulk order of books, my publisher has actually finally granted me and allowed me to get 40% off bulk orders. That's 10 plus books, but you have to come from me. You can't get that anywhere else. You could also get my book from Amazon. And I would just ask too, if you actually do take the time to read my book, and all you listeners out there, please, 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 I urge you, leave a review on Amazon. Tell everybody you know about the book. That's the main way that the book is going to make its way into other readers' hands, is by your reviews and by your referrals.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Connor. And for all you listening out there, hopefully I can be of service and support some way, somehow. If you want some mentality training, even if you just need a little spark of light, I offer 15 minutes of a free consultation or free anything. If you just need somebody to talk to during this time, go to my website and let's chat.
Awesome.